It's now 23 days since the election, 3 weeks and 2 days, and certainly it's been a time of great frustration and anxiety for Americans across the board, anticipating what our government will look like, what our executive branch will look like under the leadership of President-elect Donald Trump. And the early signs have been ones that have indeed given a great deal of concern to many groups across America, beginning with the appointment by Mr. Trump of a white nationalist as his chief strategist, an individual, Steve Bannon, who has proceeded to run a website, Breitbart, that specialized in hate, specialized in division, and it certainly reverberated in the campaign, but to bring that into the White House was something very few people anticipated would occur. And it's been followed up by other appointments that certainly were a cause of deep concern. Just yesterday, the nomination of Steve Mnuchin, a Wall Street banker, being assigned to the key post in our economy, the Treasury Secretary post, a post that will come before this chamber for confirmation. Not just someone from Wall Street, but someone who specialized in acquiring a bank that had been deeply involved in predatory lending, proceeded to foreclose on thousands and thousands of families, was using robo-signing to accelerate that in violation of the law, a specialist in turning people out of their homes, who profited enormously over the strategy at the expense of working Americans seeking to have the fundamental comfort of owning their own home. And there's a list of other appointments, nominees that have certainly more than raised eyebrows, raised anxiety, other individuals who have specialized in hate and division. And other incidents, such as the attack on the cast of Hamilton for proposing that individuals with a background of hate and division not be put into the cabinet. And then we have this from our president-elect. I quote his tweet: "In addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally." It's a straight falsehood. It's been debunked by every major analytical group, news organization in America. It's a complete fiction created in the middle of the night by our president-elect. But why? I think most people conclude that the fact that he lost the popular vote is so disturbing to the president-elect because he wants to claim a mandate. But he cannot claim a mandate because the majority of Americans voted against him. They have voted against his strategy of division. They voted against his strategy of incurring hate against Muslims, against immigrants, against women, against Hispanics, against African Americans. So no, Donald Trump, you did not get the popular vote. You lost it. You lost it straight out by more than 2 million votes, and perhaps a great deal more. And no fiction you can stir up in the middle of the night can change that fundamental fact that you have no mandate here in America for these politics of hate and division. The fact is that the citizens' vote against Donald Trump would have been far larger except for a strategy of voter suppression. Now, voter suppression is a crime against the Constitution. Our nation was founded on the vision of citizens being empowered to have a direct voice. President Jefferson wrote a letter in which he referred to the mother principle of our democracy. And the mother principle he described was that we can only claim to be a democratic republic to the degree that our decisions reflect the will of the people. And then he went on and said, and that will only happen if the people, each person, has an equal voice. And then he went on to say the biggest factor in equal voice is the power to vote. Now, we know that the original Constitution was incomplete in this vision, that it didn't provide that full empowerment to women or to minorities, flaws that we have addressed over time in this vision and understanding that the power to vote is fundamental to a democracy. Indeed, president after president over the course of our nation has recognized the power of the individual to vote as fundamental to our democratic republic. LBJ said, "The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison men because they are different from other men." And of course, he was referring to race and the battle over the Voter Rights Act, 1965. FDR said, "The ultimate rulers of our democracy are not a president and senators and congressmen and government officials, but the voters of this country." Robert Kennedy put it this way: "Each citizen's right to vote is fundamental to all the other rights of citizenship." These are not simply ideas that Democrats put forward. These are not simply ideas that our founders put forward. These are ideas that Republican presidents have put forward. Let's turn to Ronald Reagan. He said, and I quote, "For this nation to remain true to its principles, we cannot allow any American's vote to be denied, diluted, or defiled." And Ronald Reagan was right. And that's why voter suppression is wrong. It's an attack on the vision of our nation in which citizens are in charge, not powerful elites, powerful special interests. Citizens are in charge. And when you deliberately set out to take away the vote from citizens, you really are trying to shred the Constitution. So those in this chamber who have been so engaged in promoting voter suppression, end your attack on our Constitution, because it is simply wrong. And it takes away, as Ronald Reagan put it, it takes away the power of the individual. It denies, it dilutes, it defiles. Quit denying and quit diluting and quit defiling. Honor the vision of this nation in which citizens are in charge. But unfortunately, we have seen quite the opposite. We've seen a systematic Republican strategy to tear down the power to vote in our nation. And this must end. The Supreme Court set the stage for this by saying enough years had passed that the Voting Rights Act, which required areas and counties that had been active in voter suppression in the past to get pre-approval for changes in their laws so that they wouldn't go back to defiling and denying the right to vote, said enough time has passed, we can now trust them. Well, that Supreme Court decision was clearly a mistake, because immediately jurisdiction after jurisdiction proceeded to enact voter suppression laws, often carrying on a debate deliberately about how to keep minorities from voting. This wasn't something hidden. This wasn't sneaky. This was straight out aboard. We don't want those people to vote who might vote against us. Now, I'll tell you what I believe in. I believe in our Constitution. I believe in the power of citizens to vote, to be the rule makers in our country, to have Jefferson's vision, his mother principle of a democratic republic that makes decisions in accordance with the will of the people, not the will of the powerful special interests who are driving this voter suppression attack on Americans' right to vote. A study of nearly 400 counties in Alabama, Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Mississippi found more than 860 polling places were eliminated in those counties. In Arizona, almost every single county shut down voting locations. More than half the counties in Louisiana, Texas, and Alabama did so. They provided data to the researchers. Let's take a look at North Carolina, a state that passed a voter suppression law which included restrictive voter ID, ending same-day registration, requiring votes cast at the wrong polling location to be thrown out, shrinking the time for early voting by a week, and who did these things after debating directly how to suppress the right of minorities to vote. That is an evil crime against our Constitution and against the citizens of the United States of America. The law targeted African American voters with what the Fourth Circuit of Appeals described as almost surgical precision. And the law was overturned by the court. But that didn't stop North Carolina Republican Party's very direct efforts to suppress the vote, to eliminate early voting days, especially on Sunday, to severely curtail the number and hours of polling places, of closing all but one early voting location in largely African American counties, and leaving 27 fewer polling locations than in 2012. This strategy, successful. In Mecklenburg County, which includes Charlotte and has more than 15% of the state's black voters, the state reduced early voting sites from 22 to 4. And in 3 North Carolina counties with large African American populations, the Republican Party put out a piece of mail and challenged thousands of voters' registration, tried to get them stripped from the rolls until a federal court ordered them to stop. Long lines were the result at polling places that I, quote, put early voting totally out of the reach for people without the time or resources to travel long distances to vote. Crime against the Constitution, it's a crime against the citizens. And it significantly reduced turnout. It was successful. In 2008, 70% of African American voters in North Carolina voted early. Rough estimates are that about 10% fewer ballots were cast in North Carolina in 2016, and at least a substantial share of that change has to be attributed to these voter suppression efforts that produced those long lines and made it so hard for individuals to vote. We saw glaring examples of voter suppression in Wisconsin, which has one of the strictest photo ID laws in the country. A law that was ruled by the lower courts to serve no legitimate purpose, to make it unnecessarily harder to vote, designed to disenfranchise African Americans, Latino students, the elderly, people with disabilities, and low-income residents. Pure partisan crime against the Constitution, a partisan crime against the citizens of Wisconsin. As a result of this law, Wisconsin saw its lowest voter turnout in 2 decades for an election decided by fewer than 30,000 votes on the presidential. Neil Albrecht, the executive director of the Milwaukee Election Commission, said, and I quote, "Some of the greatest declines were in districts we projected would have the most trouble with voter ID requirements." And that's not all. There were online voter suppression strategies. In the final days before the election, there were a series of ads put out that were claiming to be from Secretary Clinton's campaign and basically said to folks, vote from home by text message or online. Well, of course, the law doesn't allow people to vote by text message, doesn't allow people to vote online, although there may be a few exceptions around the country. The vast majority of places you cannot vote online. Now, we've come a long way technologically in this country, but by and large, you still have to show up in person. You still have to vote your ballot. In Oregon, you have to fill out your ballot and drop it off or mail it in. Other places around the country, you have to show up at that voting booth, whether it be early voting or day of voting. An effort to mislead people is akin to other voting suppression tactics, where we've seen people put out messages that tell people the voting location has changed. People put out messages that the voting hours have changed. And this, a new clever strategy saying, don't bother to go to the voting place, you can vote by text, or you can vote online, encouraging people not to go to the polls. You know, when somebody does something like that, it should be a crime that puts them in jail for years. Misleading voters about where to vote, or the times to vote, or how you can legally vote should be a crime that puts people in jail for years. And why is that? Because it is an attack on the foundation of our democratic republic, the right to vote. It is this voter suppression strategy, a tactic which is completely at odds with the vision of a nation in which citizens are in charge, not powerful special interests. Not powerful special interests like the Koch brothers, who promised in January of 2015 to put nearly $1 billion into the 2016 election. The Koch brothers take credit for essentially controlling this chamber. And indeed, their money played a key role in race after race after race. We saw it in 2014. We thought this year in 2016. So what kind of nation do we want? A nation where oil and coal billionaires control this chamber, the Senate, or a nation in which the citizens control this chamber? A nation in which we honor Jefferson's mother's principle, or a nation in which we've handed over the keys to a few powerful special interests and billionaires? Do we want a nation of, by, and for the people, or a nation of, by, and for the powerful and the privileged? That's what's at stake here. A senior member of the Trump campaign publicly said, quote, "We have 3 major voter suppression operations underway," unquote. One of those was Operation Project Alamo, the campaign's custom online database that contained detailed identity profiles on 220 million Americans. The point is, they used this information on more than 200 million Americans to target Secretary Clinton supporters with negative and misleading Facebook ads, the goal being voter suppression, as clearly stated by a senior member of the Trump campaign. Well, let's go back to the principle laid out by President Ronald Reagan. And again, I quote him, "For this nation to be true to its principles, we cannot allow Americans' vote to be denied, diluted, or defiled." So I call on my colleagues who have been the proponents of voter suppression, who have been the proponents of attacking the Constitution, who have been the proponents of government of, by, and for the most powerful and the most privileged, rather than the people. Those words should continue to reverberate in this chamber. Colleagues, set your sights on the vision of ending your denying and diluting and defiling of the most fundamental right close to the heart of Americans and the foundation of government of, by, and for the people. Only then will we have a government that responds to the real issues that Americans face, rather than the special goals of the most powerful and the most privileged. Thank you.